Hello everyone and welcome to this video for the Bicester School History Department. This is a video for those students studying AQA GCSE History, specifically the Conflict and Tension in Asia Booklet. It will use the Conflict and Tension in Asia Booklet, which is available to download from the school website. The link is in the description. The purpose of this video is to give you some pointers on some key areas, as well as advice on how to answer some of the questions. I'd continue to pause and use this video as you work through the tasks in the booklet. If you have any more specific questions, make sure to email your history teacher for more specifics. In this video, we'll be looking at the first part of ending the war. Hopefully last time we learned about how by 1968 the war in Vietnam was becoming increasingly unpopular. And so in 1968, Nixon was elected president, and he promised that the war would continue until there was peace with honour. In short, the USA wanted to end the war, but would not agree to united Vietnam, because that would cause the spread of communism, which is what the USA had been trying to avoid the whole time. And so Nixon adopted a policy of Vietnamization. This was a way for American troops to leave the war and be replaced by South Vietnamese troops. In short, the American troops would train the South Vietnamese to fight in their place. However, the South Vietnamese were very weak compared to the Viet Cong, who had had lots of experience. And by September 1969, the US started secret peace talks to try and end the war, and slowly started withdrawing American troops, with 25,000 in June and 35,000 in September. Have a go at task 20. What did each side want to achieve at the end of the Vietnam War? Meanwhile, the Cold War had entered a new phase, the détente phase. We don't need to know all the specifics of this, but in short, it means that there was a general cooling of relations between America, the USSR, and with China. This meant that they weren't friends and they didn't agree, but they agreed that they could have some form of dialogue, and things had got a bit better. Meanwhile, the USSR and China, who had previously been allies because they were both communist, had fallen out. The USA tried to take advantage of this by having President Nixon visit China in February 1972 and the USSR in May 1972. The aim of this was to try and improve the USA's situation in negotiating a ceasefire. If they were more friendly with the country that was supplying North Vietnam, then it was likely that they might get a better deal out of the war. Have a go at task 21. Think about how the USA is trying to take advantage of the deteriorating relationship between the USSR and China. Another thing that Nixon tried to do to end the war was invade Cambodia. Now, by 1970, these peace talks were stalling. And so the USA invaded Cambodia. This is a country that's right next to Vietnam, and as discussed before, it's where some of the Viet Cong would go and hide out in order to try and regroup from the American troops. The USA thought that this would try and force the Viet Cong to the peace talk table. However, this achieved the opposite, and North Vietnam refused to talk to the USA while the USA was attacking Cambodia and Laos as well. And by 1972, the North Vietnamese had invaded the South in return, as many US troops had left, and the South Vietnamese were not as well trained. If we mentioned before, Vietnamization meant that the South Vietnamese were just not as good as the Viet Cong. In response, and to not be embarrassed, the USA bombed the north of Vietnam heavily. This shocked the US public again and made them want to leave the war. At a time where supposedly the war was ending with peace with honour, the US had bombed key targets in the north of Vietnam. Have a go at task 22. This leads us to opposition to the Vietnam War. Now this is a really big topic, so we're going to introduce it here in today's video, and then in the next episode we're going to look at it in more depth. Now, as mentioned in the last episode, the US public began to turn against the Vietnam War. Before 1967, reporters were very positive. The US news editors didn't want to publish bad news, as they didn't want to undermine the war effort. They also thought that the American public wouldn't want to see bad news. But by 1965 and continuing into 1967 and 68, TV was taking over as the most important source of news for all Americans. We learnt about this in our America module, so you might remember information about that. Similarly, technology had improved, so that TV cameras were lightweight and could be taken straight into war zones. And pictures could be broadcast live due to satellites. Therefore, the American public began to see more and more of what the Vietnam War was like. And these images were bloody and horrified the American public. This is why the Vietnam War is sometimes called a media war, because the media play a key part in the coverage, but also the outcome of the war. Have a go at task 23. Now, task 24 and task 25 use these two sources here. Now, these are again a style of the exam question that we talked about in the last episode. Have a go at task 24 first. Remember to use the sources and read them through and make sure to answer the questions. Task 25 is based off one of the exam questions in the Conflict and Tension in Asia exam paper. Now this question is worth 12 marks, so you should write about 3 paragraphs. This is the first time that we've written an answer to this style of question, so I'm going to give us a bit of advice on how we might do it. The question asks, how useful are sources A and B to a historian studying why American attitudes turned against the Vietnam War in the late 1960s? Explain your answer using the sources and your own knowledge. As mentioned before, you should write 3 paragraphs. You should write a paragraph about source A, a paragraph about source B, and then a paragraph about them both together. For your paragraph about source A, you should use the source and your own knowledge. So for example, what does source A show us about attitudes and how they changed? Well, it shows us a still of live images that American public would have seen. And it shows how the US would be shocked by this. This led to many avoiding signing up for the war, as we'll learn in the next episode. But it also shows how the Americans wanted the truth, rather than being told that all is fine. It also shows how the American media's attitude has changed because they are willing to show this on television. For source B, what does it show us about attitudes? How is the journalist talking? And what perspective are they giving? For your conclusion, you need to sum up overall. What is the overall change to American attitudes, and what do the sources tell us about that? For those aiming for top marks, make sure to say how the sources work together. For example, here they show how the media became critical of the Vietnam War, and by extension, so the US public became critical of the Vietnam War. Have a go at this answer. Don't worry if you find it tricky. And if you need any more help, please feel free to email your history teacher. Thank you for watching today's episode.